Welcome to Insight's Science After Brexit Part 1. Earlier this month, PhySoc, along with other science societies from the University of St Andrews, organised Science After Brexit, a panel discussion and Q&A on how a British exit from the EU will change science within the UK. Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of St Andrews, Professor Sally Mapstone, moderates her panel of experts consisting of Rector of the University of St Andrews and Labour Party MEP Catherine Styler, the President of the European Association for Chemical and Molecular Sciences and St Andrews Emeritus Professor, Professor David Cole-Hamilton, the Director of Scientists for Britain and UKIP Parliamentary Candidate, Professor Angus Dalgleish, and the Programme Director of Scientists for EU, Dr. Mike Galsworthy. Our panel discusses the effects Brexit might have on students, scientists and the public. Also discussed are the effects on the current largest EU research and innovation programme, Horizon 2020, which provides funding to an extensive range of scientific endeavours. Will the government prioritise science research and education post-Brexit? Will they continue to financially support researchers within the UK? And will large-scale collaborations with EU countries still be possible? These are some of the issues pertinent to our country's future, and through the panel we hope to address some of these questions. In Part 1 we will be featuring the panel discussion itself. Part 2 featuring the Q&A will be released soon, so stay tuned for that too. We would like to thank Michael Williams from PhySoc for leading the organising of this fantastic panel discussion and all other societies involved in organisation. Enjoy listening!
Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this panel discussion on Science After Brexit. My name is Sally Mapstone. I'm Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University, and my role tonight is to act essentially as compere. Now, in the true spirit of academic collaboration, this event has been organised by a coalition of our student societies, led by PhySoc and representing students across the whole range of our STEM courses from astronomy to surgery, and our Foreign Affairs Society has also played a part. And our discussion this evening has been prompted by the very laudable desire amongst our student body to hear from experts about the impact that Brexit is going to have on the STEM sector in the UK, to ask what the effects might be on students in particular, on scientists and the public, and to be equipped to leave here this evening and advocate for science research and education in the months ahead. So the first thing I would like to do is very much to commend the organisers and promoters for responding in such a constructive manner to what is obviously one of the most significant political issues of the day. Now, tonight's discussion is well-timed. Following the Supreme Court's ruling that the Prime Minister could not use the royal prerogative to trigger Article 50 and begin the withdrawal process, the two-clause European Union notification of withdrawal bill is about to receive its second reading in the House of Lords. The brief bill cleared the House of Commons unamended, but peers have declared their intention to seek significant changes up to and including a requirement for a second referendum on the terms of any Brexit deal negotiated by the UK government. Despite this, as you will know, the UK government remains confident that Article 50 will be triggered next month, and we as a university have to plan on the basis that Brexit will follow in due course. Now, to remind you, here in Scotland, Remain secured a clear majority in every council area last June, and the First Minister has taken this as a mandate to seek a differentiated settlement for Scotland and has been promoting this cause in Brussels and in dialogue with the UK government. In a more direct challenge last week, Holyrood voted by 90 to 34 on a Scottish government motion that the Brexit bill should not proceed. Campaigners for an independent Scotland have pointed out that a key plank of the No Campaign's argument was that independence would take Scotland out of the EU. As Article 50 will take Scotland out of the EU along with the rest of the UK, the Scottish Government is keeping the possibility of a second independence referendum very much in the public domain. although the constitutional arrangements for a second vote and, of course, its timing remain unclear. For this university and for our colleagues in the sector, our focus is now, as I've said, on the Brexit negotiations and on engaging as effectively as possible with Holyrood, with Westminster and with Brussels. Our key concerns are staff and student mobility, research funding and the fee status of EU undergraduates. And I want to assure you that I'm working very hard along with my fellow principals and vice-chancellors and in partnership with EuCheMS and University Scotland to keep these issues high on the priority list during the negotiations. So I'm spending a lot of my time lobbying and talking with MPs, MEPs, MSPs, ministers, and the key sector lobbying bodies. Now, having said all that, we are a global university with staff and students from 137 countries. But let's put our European engagement in perspective, and some headline figures here will indicate the importance of our relationship with Europe. 21% of our research funding over the last 5 years has come from the European Union, with funding from European Research Council sources constituting approximately 50% of our current portfolio. 22% of our academic staff and 31% of our research staff are from the European Union countries. Over 1/3 of all our postgraduate taught course entrants in 2015 to 16 were from the EU. We have 46 Erasmus Plus partners, 30 of which involve undergraduate exchanges. Last year, EU or EEA destinations accounted for 43% of our total study abroad cohort. So it will be apparent to you that we are leveraged strongly in the direction of the EU. Now, although the scale of the challenge presented by Brexit is considerable, we are confident that we can meet it because of our strong position as an outward-looking, genuinely international university that continues to recruit and attract staff and students from all over the world. And I can tell you that in the latest UCAS figures, where a lot of people are hearing that low-tariff universities are not recruiting or not attracting as many students, student applicants from the EU, we are not seeing that. At the moment, our figures are holding up very well. I'm also involved in a considerable number of appointments for members of staff at present, where we recruit very strongly internationally, and again, EU recruitment is holding up there. Our students want to know how their hopes for careers in research or academia might be affected by the referendum result. As engaged citizens, you, our students, want to know if there's anything you can do to effectively advocate for science during the exit negotiations. And I'm sure that, like many of us, you would like to understand what obstacles lie in the way of the UK government's chosen path. So let's turn to the speakers who are here to tackle these issues this evening with all of us. And I'm going to briefly introduce them, starting with our St Andrews speakers. And I intend to begin with Catherine Styler, who will be known to very many people here. Catherine Styler, MEP. She's also, of course, our university rector and plays a vital role representing student concerns. So it's only right that she receives the first welcome in this student-led event. Now, Catherine has been a member of the European Parliament for Scotland since 1999. She's currently Scotland's only female MEP, which is probably an issue for a different debate. She is, of course, a St Andrews graduate with honours in international relations and geography and an MLit in international security studies. When she was elected at the age of 25, she was the UK's youngest MEP, but already a seasoned politician, having served as president of the Students' Association and as a member of Labour's National Executive Committee. Her interests in the European Parliament include consumer protection, economics, education, the digital economy, and lung disease. She describes herself as innately pro-European. David Cole-Hamilton, on my left here, is an emeritus professor in our School of Chemistry and also president of EuCheMS, the European Association for Chemical and Molecular Sciences. The association aims to nurture a platform for scientific discussion and to provide a single, unbiased European voice on key policy issues in chemistry and related fields. Here at St Andrews, David has research interests in organometallic compounds and, I'm told, a sideline in the conservation of wooden archaeological finds. In December 2016, we're very proud of this on his behalf, he was awarded the Alvin Mittasch Prize, a global award for outstanding research in catalysis. David defines himself as, I'm quoting, a committed European and a committed chemist who truly believes that chemistry holds the keys to the future prosperity and quality of life for all. On the extreme right here, not politically, but just on the, on the stage, Dr. Mike Galsworthy is a founder member of Scientists for EU. Alongside Dr. Rob Davidson, he founded this campaign group on the 8th of May 2015, very precise date, recognizing that the Conservative general election victory had made a referendum inevitable. When not campaigning for the EU, he's an independent consultant in research and innovation policy and a visiting researcher at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He has described the EU as a scientific superpower with the UK in the driving seat. And lastly, on my right here, Professor Angus Dalgleish is here representing Scientists for Britain, a campaign group set up to counter the argument that science will suffer hardship after Brexit. Professor Dalgleish is a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, has worked as a flying doctor in Queensland, Australia, and was appointed to the Foundation Chair of Oncology at St George's University of London in 1991. He played a major role in early HIV research and studies the immune response in cancer. He believes that leaving the EU will free the UK to carry out innovative clinical research, and he threw his hat into the ring at the 2015 general election as a candidate for the UK Independence Party, standing in Sutton and Cheam. So please, first of all, let's welcome our panellists. So, for the next 45 minutes, our experts are going to be asked to tackle a variety of questions, which I'm going to put to them on your behalves. And we'll then have time for up to about half an hour of questions from the audience. And we, of course, have just been discussing this evening's event in the Green Room. We've agreed that we will do our best to conduct our conversations in a cordial and courteous manner, and we hope that we'll live up to that and that you will echo that when we have the Q&A. So let's get started on the questions. So without further ado, the first question that I'm going to put to our panel, and Catherine, as I introduced you first, I'm going to ask you to lead off on this if you would, is what are the challenges the UK government faces in repositioning the science sector post-Brexit?
I think, in response, Principal, to that question, I think firstly it's the uncertainty of what is ahead, because if you take Scotland as an example, Scotland at the moment, I think last year, benefited around £88 million in research funding across the 19 higher education institutions that are in Scotland. Now that is quite a significant amount of money, £88 million. As we go towards this triggering of Article 50, some are suggesting it could be as soon as the 9th of March, although we were told by one of the junior Brexit ministers this week that it's not going to now be the 9th of March. They hope that things will be through the House of Lords by the 7th of March, that it will be towards the end of March. But once this is triggered, and because it's never happened before, we have no idea what is ahead, because really the power and the nature of Article 50 means that the power is with the EU27 and not with the UK. So once Article 50 is triggered, then we have a situation where the EU27 will meet and debate and discuss what their priorities are. And obviously, we've got now this white paper, which I'm not sure is really worth the paper it's written on, because it doesn't say anything new about what our position is. We have said that we don't want to be part of the single market. So I'm vice chair of the Single Market Committee, so it's a bit difficult for me to. I think the single market is very important. In fact, I reread, as sad that I am, I went back to the Bloomberg speech that David Cameron made in 2013 because I was doing a university discussion last week in the States. And the fact that so strongly the point is made about how vital the EU single market is to the British economy, how central it is, and then you look to today and think, we're coming out of the single market and we're coming out of the customs union, which I don't think is in anybody's interest. But in terms of the uncertainty that we look to ahead, nobody knows. And we think that much as we hear the rhetoric about how science is important, and we see that in terms of the commitment, there's some commitment about research, which is a good thing, I'm glad to see that. Mm-hmm. However, the devil's in the detail, and we just do not know. And it's this uncertainty that I think is just quite galling when we could have certainty. And at the moment, we're looking at how Horizon 2020 will be shaped in the next framework programme, and we're going to be opting out of that discussion in some ways. So I think, in answer to your question, I think it's just fundamentally uncertainty principles.
So the greatest problem at the moment is the lack of clarity.
Yes.
So there are issues around timing. I'm sure they're trying to avoid the Ides of March, but
yeah.
Also a lack of detail, a lack of a sense of. I think possibly the other thing, I'm sure others will want to come in here, is maybe you could just comment on this a little bit more, yeah. Catherine, is the sense of how high a priority do we think science is, given all the other issues that have got to be negotiated on in relation to Brexit? Where do we think it's really sitting on the agenda?
So I would love to sit here and say I think it should be top of the agenda because I think it's central to innovation, it's central to jobs, central to our economy. But we're in this situation where if we're going into discussion where we don't want to talk about the single market, we don't want to talk about the customs union, we're just in a situation where we're going to talk about our liabilities and the money, then where does science face in that? And I think that there's a whole group of issues which should be in the discussions in those 2 years. Now, it could be that maybe it's better to get the liabilities and the discussion of the money out of the way, so then you can talk about transitional arrangements and then you can talk about the future. That is true. However, how long will it take us to discuss the liabilities, and where will the time be in the 2 years? Because the clock starts ticking the moment Article 50 is triggered. And what I fear most, Principal, is that we will be out in a shorter timescale because we, A, have nothing to talk about, B, we fall out over the money, and we come out with the worst Brexit possible.
Thank you. So, Angus, could I put the same question to you? What are the challenges the UK government faces in repositioning the science sector post-Brexit?
Well, I think the government has already taken considerable steps to address these issues, and Mike and I both appeared before the House of Lords Select Committee and the House of Commons Select Committee, and they tabled a report, which is the final version is coming out on Monday. We've seen a provisional version of it, and they've made it very clear that there's been a commitment that the same level of funding will take place. And although there was considerable fears about that initially, particularly from one or two of the Lords, Lord Hennessy in particular was rather cynical. They made it very clear, and Joe Johnson has agreed, that the level of funding will be exactly the same. And I feel very confident that having read that, in fact I read it on the way up on the train today, having read it, that they are very, very educated as to the need for the science base and the science funding to remain at least as good as it is today, with the funding and our participation with the European collaborations. And here it just leaves it to me to say, there's a big difference in semantics here. We're not trying to leave Europe. We're not trying to leave European collaboration and funding. We're trying to leave a European Union that's basically wanted ever closer integration to what I see as the detriment of British science, with so much rules, regulations and red tape, which is why I stood up and threw my hat in the ring and saying, I think that this is the aspect I'd want to leave. The rest of it is fine. Just do not want to be dictated by Brussels. And I think that that is an important thing because it's become very clear in all the people that we've met and all the debates we've been to and the people we engage with, is that there's been an abnegation of responsibility by the British government and British institutions, that they passed everything to Brussels without really thinking about it. And when you try and get accountability and people to account for very bad decisions, etc., they go, well, it's nothing to do with me, it's Brussels now. And I think that is totally wrong. I want to be able to hold people to account for things that aren't working. So I think that our interactions with the government at the moment, I am satisfied that they really have appreciated the need for us to remain very much in the status quo with our research and collaboration with Europe and the funding.
Thank you. So that's obviously a pretty upbeat response. You talked about the same level of funding being made available, and you also talked, Angus, a bit about collaboration. But do you think that there will be, even if there is the same level of funding available from the UK government, do we think that the opportunities for collaboration will be as good and creative as they are at present? What would you say about that?
I would say I do think they will be very good. First of all, on the funding, our analysis and research into all this has revealed something I was rather horrified to find, and that in spite of the fact that we really are the number one science base in the whole of Europe, we do it on less money percentage-wise than does France and Germany. And I think that one of the issues of this exercise is we should increase the funding of our science base in the UK in order to compete. And with regards to how we do, I mean, we will always be, as Mike has said, you know, we're in the driving seat in Europe. Of the top 10 universities in Europe, 7 of them are from the UK. One is from Switzerland, which is Zurich, which is not in the EU. The other is the Karolinska, and recently Munich's come in. And with regards to all the collaborations we've got, most of those were in place long before Lisbon and Maastricht came along. You know, things like CERN, all the European molecular biology research treatment of cancer, Space Agency, the European Observation Agencies, all these were in place, up and running, working really well before the EU started to interfere. And I use the words carefully because they were working very well without Brussels telling them what they funded and what they couldn't do.
Thank you. So Angus and Mike are clearly spending quite a lot of time sharing platforms with each other. So I'm going to turn to Mike now just to say, what would your take be on these questions of challenge?
Right, so first of all, yeah, Angus and I have debated many places together, and it's important to say early on that we all have similar interests for British science, which is lowering barriers to innovation, lowering barriers to movement of people and transfer of ideas, and increasing of potential to collaborate. And so the only thing we've sort of disagreed on is whether the EU itself as an institution has been a help or a hindrance to that. I think that the biggest challenge that we face immediately is UK's branding for science. So as one person said in the BBC report, on the day that the Brexit vote happened, the UK went from being cool to being not cool. And I think that's felt quite widely throughout the science community, both in the UK and the EU. Now, the vast majority of the UK science community was for remaining in the EU. And I think there was a lot of appreciation, not just for money, because if you're just pushing around money, then, you know, what's the point of that? But the added value of having a shared pot of money, the added value of sharing regulations, of sharing policy, of sharing infrastructure, of having freedom of movement, we all found that by experience, this really facilitated the kind of work we could do, putting together dream teams across Europe and applying for one pot of funds in order to do those large projects, and then the freedom of movement itself, and then the cohesion with policy was really fit for the 21st century. And you see it in the impacts of international papers from the UK versus domestic only, plus 40% in impact when you bring in international partners. So it looked to most of us like being in the driving seat of this big change in science when we're starting to network up around the world, and the EU being the hub, with output growing faster than the US, was a good place to be. And so then when you Brexit from that, and people are saying, why do you want to do that? And if the reasons come down to, we don't like sharing rules with other people, we don't like other people coming to our country in the numbers that they do, we don't like paying into a pot with other people, then it seems small and meaner. And you can say global Britain all you like, but the impression that has been given out is the challenge that we face now. So I agree with Angus that European science is fantastic, and European science is bigger than the EU because it's also the European Space Agency, and it's also CERN and dozens of research infrastructures. And I think now we should double down on all of that to show that we're not pulling away, but we also do need to give credit where credit's due, which is that the EU has been a fantastic driving force in all of this new philosophy of working together across policy and regulations and sharing money and sharing people. And I think we need to be more open-hearted and gracious and team-spirited on that level, because if we don't, then I think we are going to see people not wanting to come to our universities here and our businesses here because they don't believe in our philosophical outlook. So I think we have to work on that ourselves, and we have to work on that through our politicians to say, despite some of the other Brexit dynamics, within the science community, we are absolutely cohesive with the world and with our continent and looking to share and work together to bring out the best for everyone. So I think it's a branding thing, which strongly complements the confusion that we'll be wading through at the same time. Those are the two big challenges.
Right, okay, thank you. And the question, of course, is also partly about what are the challenges the UK government faces in repositioning the science sector. David, what would you say on that?
Well, I think there are really 4 different areas where they have to address. We've already heard about funding, and it's probably the least important one in many ways. If they're prepared to agree that the amount of funding we will have will be equivalent to what we have, what we take out of Europe and what we have within the UK already, then I think that's a very positive sign. But that's probably, as I say, the least important. I think much more important, as you mentioned, is the ability to do large collaborative projects. And I'm not talking about huge ones like CERN now. I'm talking about ones where you're tackling a real problem and you need a number of different groups to work together. So if I give you an example in my own career, I recently was in a project which had 19 partners, 13 universities, 6 companies from 8 different European countries. That funded 1,407 person hours. That's 100 years worth of work of people being employed through that project. It was 16 million overall. The European community gave 10 million, 11 million. And we had a number of different case studies where we were trying to take fundamental research through to the demonstrator stage. And we had 6 different case studies, and 4 of those got to the stage where they were ready to be taken up by industry. How do we do that if we only have the money that we put into the pot? By being able to get money from the whole pot, we could get a very large sum of money to do that. And that's just one example. So I think this idea of large collaborations, not huge collaborations like CERN, but large collaborations where we're tackling real problems, in my case in the chemical industry, which is a really important industry, it's difficult to see how we can do that if we don't retain the kind of ties we have with Europe. Now, you could say we could do that with America, we could do it with Australia, we could do it with Russia. Well, we could, but we have to have all those different treaties set up, and they have to agree that they want to do it, and we're never going to have a pot which is put in by 27 different countries that we have at the moment, which is big enough and has the critical mass to allow us to do those kinds of things. So I think collaboration is hugely important. And another one that was mentioned is mobility. And I had a look at my own research group over the 40 years that I was a researcher. In the first 20 years, I had almost entirely British PhD students. In the last 20 years, more than half have come from Europe, a number from outside and a number from the UK. The same with postdocs, a bit more varied there because they come from all over the world. And I'm not talking about small numbers here, I'm talking about 60 or 70 different PhD students. So that has been hugely important. And without those people, I would not have been able to do the research that I was able to do in my career. So I think funding, collaboration, mobility. And the other one the government has to look very, very carefully at is regulation and advice. Because at the moment, there are over 300 regulations about chemistry which have come from the European community. Are they going to repeal all of those? Which ones are they going to keep? Which ones are they going to throw away? Most of them are for the benefit of everybody. So there's a thing called REACH legislation, which makes you register everything that you make as a chemical, a new chemical. And it has to pass certain tests, and you have to do certain tests on it. And if it doesn't pass, it can't be allowed to be used in the European community. And anybody from outside the European community who wants to export into the European community has to pass those tests as well. And the reason it's there is to protect every individual, every one of us, from the harm that some chemicals can do. But by having that legislation, you can be pretty confident that the stuff you are using, all the stuff we use every day in our lives, is safe, or as safe as we can understand it. We shouldn't repeal that legislation. But we've got to decide now, of all these 300 legislations, which ones we keep and which ones we throw away. It's a massive task. So those are the 4 things I would highlight.
Right. Thank you very much. So you've heard a real kind of range of challenges and ways of seeing here. I'm going to now open up some more questions, and these, let me just also stress that these are very much questions that have been put through to us by the organisers and the students who had the idea for this particular evening's meeting. So I'm very much channeling the things that you said that you wanted to hear from us, our speakers on. So we're hearing a fair amount about the future, but we've also heard, both David and Angus have spoken about things that have been done in the past in relation to science in Europe, both, as it were, within the EU, but also standing clear of it and in some cases predating it. So I'd like to ask at least a couple of our panellists to think through with us this particular question. And Angus, perhaps I could start with you, if that's okay, which is how has the UK's science sector interacted with Europe in the past? And what can we improve on? And what should be our priorities to maintain and keep? And I think this speaks a bit to some of what you were saying earlier. So what have been the interactions with Europe in the past in terms of science, and what can we improve on? What should we be keeping?
That's a very good question. There have been many things we collaborate on. Some of them I've mentioned relative to my own interests. The European Molecular Biology Laboratory and the European Organisation of Research and Treatment in Cancer, European Society for Medical Oncology. These are all things that relate to me, and they were up and running, and I was involved with them before the EU started forming these hubs. And let me make it very clear that I've actually benefited very, very well from a couple of framework programs with regards HIV research, and a lot of us were able to get together to really ask fundamental questions, and it was a very good example of how it brought people with various resources together, and we spent quite a while working out and then finally realizing that with HIV you don't get ill unless you get a very strong activation of the immune system. And this was really exemplified because it's not there now, but there used to be a chimp colony in near Rotterdam where we collaborated with them and learned so much fundamental science about that. So I have actually been a beneficiary of all this. But I think that now these things are up and running. We still have the meetings, they're all there. If the EU, we're out of the EU tomorrow, we're not going to leave any of these organisations or memberships. And certainly with my colleagues, and some of them up here have been very vocal that clinical trials, especially in cancer, will collapse if we leave. I think nothing could be further from the truth, because all those networks are so well established that in the EU or out the EU, we're still going to do them. And I just think it is behold me to actually say I've said some great things about being in the EU and research and how I've benefited, But, what made me turn against the EU, and that was basically I was doing clinical trials of cancer vaccines in cancer patients, and some of them we were using dendritic cells, which means we were culturing cells in the laboratory and giving them back to patients. And when the European Union Clinical Trial Directive came in, I was informed that after the 1st of April, if I continued to do this, I would be committing a criminal crime and could go to jail for something I'd been doing for several years with many grateful patients. And when I looked into this, I realized that this was a typical example of under harmonization as the lots of law of unintended consequences were pouring out of Brussels without anybody thinking of what they actually meant for the man in the street, or in my case, the patient in the bed. And eventually, they said that it'd been thought through well, they weren't going to rescind it. Long story short, well, even the big pharmaceutical companies that pushed this realized it was holding research back, holding back innovation entering the clinic translation, and they've decided to rewrite and rework it. But it doesn't come in to next year, and it's far too little, far too late. I'm not going to go back and start my research programs with the patients all those years later. I've had to move on. And that was the reason, and it made me realize there's far too many directives coming out. And one thing I would say that's very important here is our government actually applied them without thinking. Many of these things were not applied in that way in France and Germany, whereas they used some pragmatic sense and thought we can't apply these to universities, it will stop our clinical research. Our government didn't do that, and I think that's something I hold very much, and it's very much like the Working Time Directive, which has really crippled the NHS by making doctors only work 48 hours. I find that in France and Germany, they pay lip service to the 48 hours, but make everybody do an extra 12 hours practical postgraduate training, i.e. carry on working to 60 hours. Well, our government didn't do that. And so this is the sort of thing that I think that we should be glad we're out of, because my big burn with this is that the government abnegated their responsibilities and stopped governing and just did what they were told to by Brussels. And I think that really...
Right, yeah. And when you say the government, you're not really distinguishing between what presumably were Tory and Labour governments?
I'm not distinguishing between them. Right. They've all been equally as hopeless.
Okay. Thank you. Mike, you look like you wanted to come in on that.
First of all, just a question, because I don't know, and I've never asked you this, that the people who told you you'd become a criminal overnight, was that UK level or was that Commission?
UK level interpretation of the Commission. Yep. And it was as the university and the hospital, NHS, top people from both came to tell me this. That was their interpretation. And in retrospect, they should never...
And yet, the UK government, no decisions made at Brussels level without government approval. So basically, how you describe it, and also interestingly, when you talk about the Clinical Trials Directive and the improvement on it, I'm very proud of the fact that Glynis Wilmot has been leading on that, a British MEP who sadly will no longer be leading on it because she will no longer exist to basically listen to the concerns that you put over. And I'm very pleased that you agree that the work that she has done will make a real difference to clinical trials. I just hope then we will abide by the Clinical Trials Directive, and sadly in the future we'll have no power over how it will be amended, sadly, but I'm glad Glynis's work has been...
the Brits had a big input on it, not just British MEPs, but also British academic societies, I think, had the major input on revising it from a clinical trial directive, which is basically a set of guidelines about, standards that they'd like to see everyone meeting, and then it's up to the national governments themselves how that gets implemented. And in our case, clearly our government screwed up on that, but also the Commission were slow to respond on that as well. So it was a bit of both. The Commission were also told this could be doing some damage, and they said, we'll wait to see what comes through. But anyway, changing that to a clinical trial regulation, which is basically a more law-like stipulation of what needs to happen. The whole reason for having harmonization is so that you can work cross borders on the same standards and on the same rules, and no one's undercutting other people, and you can do the larger scale projects. So in some areas, of course, this gets very fiddly, and you can make mistakes, and then you need to go and revise them in good time. And I think that that's the way it needs to go anyway, and it's always good to be involved in playing in that. What was the original question? Because I wanted to prattle about that too.
So the question was actually looking back to the UK's engagement, science sector's engagement with Europe in the past, and what do we actually want to take from that to keep and to change and to improve?
Yes. So let me tell you about my experience with the EU as it evolved in my career, quickly. I won't ramble. And that is, back when I was in Switzerland in 2005, I was first looking at EU grants because they were entitled to them. I couldn't get anywhere on the websites. It drove me mad. I loathed the EU science program at that stage. Then some years later, when I was in Slovenia, I got involved in this project to go through all the life sciences projects of the EU, find the best ones, sing their praises for their website, send them all the right ones. So we asked them for the data on this, and they wouldn't give us the data. And we said, you've just approved our projects, give us the bloody data or we can't do our work. And they said, well, they're data privacy things. And we said, you don't know the first thing about data privacy. This is researchers, this is public funding, this is... So anyway, we threatened, we got the data, then we looked through the data were useless, and then we couldn't even get in touch with a lot of people that had run projects because the names were obsolete. And so at this stage, we thought, what do we do with the project? And I took it over and said, right, we've got how much they were all funded, let's do a big economic analysis of where the money went. And so we coded it all up by areas. And we went through all of that, and then I published papers showing that only half of the projects had actually produced papers that you could trace by scraping Google Scholar and then mapping that through. So I started very critical, but at the same time, I then went on to go and say, right, well, look at the opportunities here. If, you can reduce this was with a view to Horizon 2020 coming up. I said, okay, so for Horizon 2020, this is when I was really getting into science policy. You need to cut down the time to grant. You need to cut down the bureaucracy, like the stupid timesheets. You need to be doing this and that and all the rest and think about big data and open data and open access. And they've been doing all of that in recent years. And Horizon 2020, unlike any other sort of program you see around the world, really has its own feel, really has its own brand, really has excited a lot of people working in science just because of the way it works. People think, right, this is it, this is European science, this is what it feels like. We all work together, we share everything, and it networks with the rest of the world, and we're the hub of this. It feels right, it feels like it's going in the right direction. And that is, from someone who is skeptical and cold-hearted about it before, that's the thing that really warmed me to it and made me want to fight for it.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move us on a bit. We've talked about the past. Now let's try and talk about the future. And we've said that future is uncertain, but the key thing, obviously, is for the UK to be positioning itself in relation to science and scientific engagement in the future. So there are two parts to this question, and the first part may actually be, the answer may be quite short, but the second, I really invite members of the panel to focus on and give our audience some pointers in this. So what do we know about plans for the future in terms of how do we think about the UK scientific presence in the future? And what should our aims be? It's important to have clear aims, so what should our aims be? Catherine, start us off on that.
Okay, so I think plans for the future. Well, I think that if I take my best case scenario, say of Brexit and what will happen, I would hope that the collaborations that we have benefited from will be allowed to continue. I'd hope that researchers will be able to cross borders and be able to do that, and students alike. I'd hope there will still be that type, because it's not just as, I think you said it quite well, about it's not just about the money, it's about the people contact, the collaboration, the people involved. And if that is not allowed to happen, that's the thing that we will miss, yes, but the people, that's the key aspect. So I'd hope that we would continue with that attraction of talent, and we'd be able to do all of those things in a free and equitable manner that we kind of have just now. That's the best case scenario. Do I think that's going to happen? Well, not if we reject the single market and say we don't want to be part of the single market and we don't want to be part of a customs union right away. I mean, I think that sets the tone of the negotiations in a way that I don't think is helpful to gain the things that we want to gain out of the negotiations. That's one aspect, I think. In terms of what has been guaranteed, yes, the government has said we will retain, but then what about the future? And that's what you're asking about, Sally. What is the future? So at the moment, the discussion that's happening about how this future framework, and we have, of any country across the European Union, we have so benefited from Horizon 2020. We've outshone, and that's something where, in the future, we're not going to be part of that decision-making process because we're opting out of being in the European Union. There's consequences for that. You can't, well, as Donald Tusk said, quoting Boris Johnson, who said that you can have your cake and eat it, and Donald Tusk turns around and says, take a cake, eat it, see what's left. Not a lot. He said, all that will be on the table are salt and vinegar. You're like, I mean, that's the person who's head of the council. So I think all you can do at the moment is scenario plan. What would the best case scenario look like? And I would like it to be the one where we can continue what we've benefited from. And that's my wish. But what do I think in my darker moments is that we'll have something that is certainly not as good as what we have at the moment.
Okay, thank you. David, what would your view be?
Well, just picking up on a couple of points and putting some stuff on it, sure. Some bones, some flesh on the bones. Yeah, I mean, just for chemistry, for example, 25% of our funding comes from Europe, so it's a very massive amount of money that we have, and we get about 15% of the Horizon 2020 budget coming into the UK, and in universities it's something like 25%. We put in, I think, it's difficult to get this number, but I think it's about 12%. So we do benefit massively from being in Europe. Now, having said that, I think there are three possible ways that things could go. One would be we could have a situation like, this is assuming that we do leave the European community, which I think we shall. Then we could have a situation like Norway, which is a member of the European Research Area. It puts money in, it has its grants assessed by the panels, and it receives money from the community. That would be one possibility. The second one, it could be a situation rather like Switzerland has had up until just recently, when they had the referendum on not allowing Croatians into free movement into Switzerland. They were removed from the European Research Area, but they were allowed to continue competing for grants. But their funding came from Switzerland. It didn't come from the European community. If they won grants, the money came from Switzerland. They've now been let back into the free market. So that's another possibility. And the disadvantage there is, well, that would fit with the government's desire not to have free movement of people. Of course, I don't think the first one would be allowed if we don't have free movement of people. The only disadvantage of the first one is a disadvantage of anything we do with Europe. We would no longer have any say in how it runs, which is the choice we have made as a country. The third one is that we become totally independent from Europe and we have to try to set up some other arrangement. Now, my understanding is, from what Theresa May says, she's rather keen to have the first one. And I think most scientists, not all scientists, but most scientists would prefer to have the first one, retain much what we have at the moment, receiving money from, putting money in and receiving money out. Now, of course, because we take out more than we put in, which is why I gave you the numbers just now, it may well be that our colleagues in Europe would say, well, actually, we don't want that. But that is not what I hear from the people in Europe. The people in Europe see the UK as really important to European science. And so I'm talking about scientists in Europe. So scientists in Europe want us to remain as engaged as we possibly can, to be involved in the projects, doing the science, because we enhance the projects. There's no question about that. So I think Theresa May wants the first one. If she won't, and then I think she would have to allow at least free movement of people for research. Whether you can have a special kind of arrangement for research or not, I don't know, but I hope she will go in and fight strongly for that. the things we have to maintain, that whatever of these we have, if we don't have either of the first two, then, and we have the third one, then I think the things we have to maintain the funding is at the level we have at the moment, which is what we've been told is going to happen. That's a good thing. We have to maintain access to the major infrastructural projects like CERN and so on, which are there. We have to have, and we've already talked about this, we have to have mechanisms for funding large collaborative grants, which we can't do on our own. That has to be with other countries, and there have to be ways in which we do that. And think about, suppose we can't collaborate with Europe. Who can we collaborate with? We collaborate with the United States, we collaborate with Canada, Australia. The only, and the United States is slightly dodgy at the moment. The only, I mean, when you think about what we've done, we've said we don't want to have anything to do with these people. The people we don't want to have anything to do with are the only people, apart really from the Australians, the Canadians, the New Zealanders, and the Japanese, who really believe in truth and honesty in the way that we do. And I think that's a tragic thing to have done. So we need to have some way of doing these large collaborative grants. If it means having international treaties with everybody, that's fine, but I think that's going to take an awfully long time to set up. We need to be able to collaborate with industry and with the right scientists to do the job, and many of those are in Europe. And possibly one of the most important things is we must be able to have a method by which the best people in the world can come and work here. They can come and do research in our research groups. They can come and run research groups. I see people in the audience here who I know very well who are from Europe who are running research groups in this university. And we welcome and we hope you'll stay. And this is so important to us, to be narrow, only British, working together. It's a bit like, there is a university which I won't name, in Scotland, which in chemistry appointed, it was an outstanding university in chemistry. It appointed to its staff only people who came from that university. It is now way down in the league. Here in St Andrews, we were very small. We were one of the lowest rated departments in chemistry 30 years ago. We've appointed a massive number of staff from outside, well, hardly any in the department, but masses from outside the department, masses from outside Scotland, masses from outside the UK, and some from outside Europe. And we're now one of the top departments in the country. And that intermingling of people is what's made that possible.
Thank you. You can see how passionately all of our speakers feel about these issues, and that is because there is that sense that we're living in a really decisive moment. Things are not going to be the same, and that's why it's so important to kind of focus and ask ourselves these questions about what do we want. You've heard a very clear articulation about that from David here. Now, conscious of time, I'm going to switch to not completely, but a rather different question, which I'm just going to ask each of our panelists. It's again a question that our students have put forward to us. I'm going to ask each of our panel to try and engage with this quite briefly, if you would. I'm going to start with you, Mike, and this is just taking a slightly different tack, which is to say, okay, in the event of Brexit, what can the UK do to make its voice heard on climate change going forward within the European community?
Right. I think that it's very important that the UK clearly backs all of the global initiatives in order to tackle climate change. And I think that Europe as a whole clearly needs to be championing it very strongly with what's going on in the States. Britain maybe has a particular capacity to reach over to the US on that. I mean, certainly we're developing some very strong and worrying links between the US and the UK in terms of the climate change denial groups and networks. But because we've got that link going through, I think certainly we need to feed it back the other way and say, no, really, guys, come on. I think that can be our special role.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Catherine. We'll go to you next.
Well, I'd like to see the Department for Climate Change rebuilt and brought back together. That might be a start to show our commitment to climate change. But I think at the end of the day, it's the commitments that we've signed up to. and to make sure that those are delivered upon. And I think that if we have signed up to EU rules that help us, then those in this Great Repeal Act, they should not be repealed, they should be maintained. I think that's one thing that we could hope for, to kind of make sure that our commitment to climate change is as strong as it's ever been.
Thank you. Angus.
You said to be brief, and I'll try to be very brief. You've got to be very careful what you wish for and what you think you can do. Under the EU auspices for climate change, there was massive directives for everybody to switch to diesel because it didn't give out carbon dioxide and lead to global warming. And now that there's so many diesel cars around now, in the major cities in the UK, we are all having absolutely toxic levels of nitric oxide, and there's about 100,000 people, you're very interested in lung disease, being directly from diesel, which is nothing, not even to do with cancer. And I think that you've got to be very, very careful what you actually agree and push for with regards to so-called climate change.
Thank you. Now, David.
Well, I think we should remember that although we're withdrawing from the European Union, we're not withdrawing from Europe. So the organisation which Sally mentioned, I'm president of EuCheMS, which is a body which coordinates the work of all the chemical societies in Europe. Our constituency is geographical Europe. It's not the European community. So we have Russia, we have Turkey, we have Switzerland, Norway. All of those are members, and the UK will remain a member. And there are bodies like this covering all subjects throughout Europe. Those bodies lobby the European community. And so the UK, these bodies become much more important to the UK than they were before, because they become a channel through which the UK can have its voice heard in the European community. And it will be able, I think, to not drive climate change, but drive the people who are advising on climate change.
Right, good. Okay, thank you. And I know you're going to want to join with me to thank our panel for a really constructive, civilised, wide-ranging conversation. And this is a conversation that people who are serious about science are going to want to continue, and we will certainly try to continue it here. So please join with me in thanking our panel.
You've been listening to Insight, the University of St Andrews Student Physics Society's podcast. We hope you found this discussion insightful. Part 2 featuring the Q&A will be released in the coming weeks. We would like to again thank Michael Williams for directing this event. In past episodes, Insight has interviewed academics from the University of St Andrews discovering their passions, inspirations and motivations. Please subscribe to receive alerts when new episodes are released. You can join our mailing list, subscribe and access our episodes through our website. Just Google Insight St Andrews. Insight is also available on iTunes, Overcast and other popular podcast platforms. Join the discussion on PhySoc's Facebook group. Insight is produced by myself, Samuel Lavery and Conor McBride. The following University of St Andrews societies contributed to the organisation of this event: AstroSoc, PhySoc, BMS, ChemSoc, Foreign Affairs, PhySoc, PsychSoc, SUMS and SurgeSoc. Thanks for listening!